Well, good day. You're welcome to this lab help session. Tatum, I see you're here. In today's session, we're going to go over the textbook, and I'm going to highlight things that you should know. I'm presuming that you have listened to the recording from yesterday. And I'm going to take just a moment and ask if you have any questions as a result of listening to that, either procedural questions, topical questions, questions about the reading, questions about the requirements and assignments. So if you do, please unmute yourself and ask them. I can assure you that if you've got a question, others have the same question probably. And I certainly welcome questions. It helps me focus on what you need to hear rather than what I want to say. So I'm going to take this opportunity to stop just a moment and open up the meeting for any questions that you might have. Okay, there being none, we're going to plow right into this. I am recording this and we'll put it on YouTube just like the lecture. I'm going to try to record one of these help sessions a week, and I've decided that this week I'm going to record the 100 meeting. So since it's the same course, same text, same subject matter, that should be of interest to everybody, no matter what section you're in. So open up your textbook on your screen, if you would please, and we're just going to go right into it. We, of course, begin with chapter 1. The main heading is the question, what is ethics? And as we've said, ethics is misnamed as a subject matter. It really should be moral theory. So at the very first section, Poyman jumps into the question of what makes up ethics. And he decides that there are three things that make up ethics. And I agree with him, there are three things. We disagree about what the first one is. The first aspect of moral theory, he says, is descriptive morality. He says, and I'm quoting him, refers to actual beliefs, customs, principles, and practices of peoples and cultures. The second is moral philosophy, or what we've called moral theory. And sometimes he says ethical theory. We're just going to name it moral theory. And the third is applied ethics. Those are the special fields of ethics, like medical ethics. After working on my doctorate, I went back and took a degree in medical ethics, and that has served me well over the years in terms of finding work. So even when teachers of philosophy were not in high demand, they're still not in high demand, by the way. All right, what he calls descriptive ethics, I don't consider the purview of philosophy. That's more sociology. Sociology asks and answers the questions about what are particular beliefs, practices, thinking that is endemic to a culture or a people. Hence the term descriptive. This is really descriptive behavior, and behavior is not the purview of philosophy. So Dr. Poiman and I, well, I think he's probably the greatest genius that ever wrote a textbook in ethics or moral theory. We disagree about this. Descriptive morality is not the purview of ethical theory, and I'll leave you to think about that and encourage you to think about it. So descriptive morality is more the work of sociology, I would think. So here are my three suggestions about the subdivisions of ethics. Number one would be moral theory, what he calls moral philosophy or ethical theory. So that's number one, replacing descriptive morality. The second is meta-ethics. These are asking questions about questions of ethics. So this is going beyond ethics to ask questions about the questions. And then third, of course, would be applied ethics, philosophy of business ethics, medical ethics, that sort of thing. And as I've suggested, that's huge. My background is an administrative law judge and medical theory for the government. So I've been able to use that degree in applied ethics. Now, at the very end of that discussion of the subdivision of ethics, he talks about, he says the study of ethics is not only of instrumental value, but he also says it's valuable in and of itself. An instrumental value is something that is useful, and I think you would agree that it's useful to try to decide what we ought to do. But philosophy has, and I think this is probably more important even than this instrumental value of what we're up to right now, what I would call the intrinsic value. So it's valuable in and of itself. It's a valuable thing to do, like art has intrinsic value. Philosophy, like art, has intrinsic value. So I would encourage you to think about the difference between instrumental value, useful value, and intrinsic value, something that is worth doing for the sake of doing it. Thinking is more important than just what it gets you. It's an important thing to do. Now, at the very end of that section on the subdivisions, ethics and its subdivisions, I want you to understand that there are a lot of theories about ethics, a lot of competitive theories about ethics, a lot of differences of, I hate to use the word opinions because these positions were developed much more strongly than one's opinion about them. As a matter of fact, from Plato on, we have been interested in knowledge with a capital K, something which went far beyond anybody or any particular person's opinion, people trying to find the truth. Plato began by thinking that there was an absolute truth. Toward the middle part of his life, he began to think of truth as what he called justified opinion, where we've established the character of something, we've justified that, not just opinion, but it's been proven value. It had valuable. It has a cash value, I guess we might say, and that he considered to be the truth. In the middle part of Plato, that's about as close as you can get to the truth, but it's still the truth. So whether truth is an absolute truth or a medial justified truth, it's still the truth. Now, if you look on page 6, I'm sorry, you don't have pages on the text. If you'll turn over to the traits of moral principles, that's the next section. Morality is compared with other normative subjects. That's where law and religion and etiquette are discussed. And that very next section is what he calls the traits of moral principles. And he lists 5. And these are crucial. Now, I can guarantee you that you're going to see a question about these traits of moral principles. Any legitimate moral theory has these 5 characteristics. We'll talk about those in a minute. But right now, I can tell you that as far as I am concerned, most of the theories that we're going to discuss have limitations on the basis of whether they follow, whether they can claim to have these traits that he lists under moral principles. I hope I'm making myself clear. Well, just let me say, and that in my own history of working with these issues, Immanuel Kant, the great German 18th century, early 18th century philosopher, was probably technically the most correct person to ever write about moral theory. I don't think that anyone has his scope and understanding. But for Immanuel Kant, what he did was so far above the capacity of most human beings to comprehend that even though he's right about most things, it's very difficult for that to be practical. And if you look under the traits of moral principles, the very last one that's listed is practicality or practicability, as Dr. Poeman terms it. So even though Kant is technically correct, his theory at least is dropped down a couple of notches because it's simply not communicatable to the average person. Let me use an example here of when I was growing up. There was a man in my community that was the best rock mason that I have ever seen in my life. He could take a pile of rocks of all different shapes, sizes, types, and he could make a wall that was perfectly straight. When he finished with it, it looked like a brick wall almost. He had an innate capability of putting those things together to make that wall perfect, straight, flush. He was a physicist. He was a practical physicist. When I met him, he was 90 years old and still working. He didn't graduate high school. I don't even know if he graduated elementary school, but he could make something using the principles of physics that he never understood in order to make something with physics that was perfect. But he was not educated. Now, if he had been a Kantian stonemason, he would have had to have studied the nth degree of making these walls and then maybe not be able to do it. He didn't have that capacity. He didn't have the capacity to go to college and to get a doctor's degree in physics. But he certainly could use the theories of physics without even knowing what they were. Now, if he were a Kantian ethics person, he would have to know these theories in order to do what he does or did. So Kant's got a limit, and his limit is due basically to his, I hesitate to use the word failure because it's not a failure. He was too good, I guess you might say, at doing what he did. And because of that, he has limitations in his theory. I hope I'm communicating that to you. So most of the argument here about whether we ought to follow one of these ethical theories that we're going to discuss are really arguments about whether they are prescriptive, universalizable, overriding, public, or practicable. So those are the things that we're going to apply to try to discover not just what is true, but what is useful when it comes to a moral theory. Okay, I hope I communicated that. It's not an easy thing to communicate. I hope I at least brought it to your attention so that you can think about it. An elegant theory may be correct, but fail the publicity angle. A feel-good theory may appeal to a lot of people, but lack overridingness or universality, which is one of the characteristics that Poyman says must be there if a theory is to be true and useful. All right, enough of that horse, beating that dead horse. Let's move over on to morality as compared with other normative subjects. Now here he mentions religion, law, and etiquette. Etiquette, I fear, is what most people think when they ask the question of what is good, what ought I to do. I think probably etiquette is more often than not what people mean when they use the term ethics, and it's just plain wrong. The example I used is as a child, when I would walk into my elementary school, the principal would, if you stepped over the threshold of the door into the school and you still had your ball cap on, the principal would knock it off your head and make you pick it up and put it in your pocket. He just thought that being a good person was taking your hat off when you walked into a building. Well, you know, you can still be a good kid and forget to take your hat off when you walk into a house. So should not be confused with being a good person. But unfortunately, that's what most people mean, I think, when they say, is someone ethical? Does someone follow the teachings of their town? Now, maybe in the next town or the next country, they don't do things that way. And just because one has a habit doesn't necessarily mean that that is right or wrong. But etiquette confuses those with the question of what ought I to do, what acts are right. So etiquette is a failed ethics, but it's one of the things that people most often think when they think, what ought I to do? The second one is religion. Now, religion is a better measure of the question, what ought I to do? As a matter of fact, I think most ethical theories are derived from some sort of religious theory. That's true in the East or the West. Whether you take a philosophy course in India, the principles of Indian universities are based on principles of Hinduism and Buddhism. In the United States, most of the questions about what ought I to do had an earlier answer in Judaism and the practice of the Hebrew faith and in the practice of the Christian faith derived from that, and in Mideastern countries, the Islamic faith, which again is derived from the same source as Christianity, depending heavily upon the answers to right and wrong that were established in early biblical tradition. Kant, for instance, says that we should follow what he calls what we would call the golden rule. For him, it's called the categorical imperative. And everyone around Christianity, not just raised in the church, but anyone raised in a society that is formed through Judaism and Christianity knows the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So much of Kantian teaching, even though he's not a Christian in the sense of the church-going kind of Christian, but he still bases most of his theory on that, which he terms not the golden rule, but the categorical imperative. Now, look, this fits with our discussion earlier on when we talked about the thought, the development of the thinking, how people think. It begins with religion, it moves to philosophy, and ultimately to science. And everything that we do, even minute decisions that we make, follow that same paradigm. We begin with things that we believe are true. And then if we're philosophical or scientific, then we test them. Maybe if we just stick with religion, we don't test them. But every person begins the thinking process in a religious way. Excuse me. So religion is important as a sort of foundational aspect that provides us with the theories to be tested philosophically. So religion is foundational to everything that we do in moral theory or ethics. And then from the moral theory, from the philosophical ethics angle of this, we develop laws. Laws follow philosophy. So first of all, we have moral theory, and then from moral theory, we develop laws. So we have beliefs, analysis, and law develops from those philosophical principles. But it's easy to confuse law and ethics. Law is simply nothing but codified ethics. And though that the ethics part of that at least begins with some type of religious belief. Now, I call your attention, in the Western world, we would look at the Ten Commandments as one of these baseline structures for development into ethical theories. We have, in Hebrew thinking, these are not commandments. In Hebrew, they are hatavarim, the 10 words. So there are 10 ways that we lead the good life. So built into this idea of the 10 commandments and Deuteronomy and Exodus in the Old Testament is automatically a theory about the good life. I hope you follow what I mean. So we use these, there's so many times in the past, we've had these huge debates in the United States about whether we should have the 10 Commandments someplace on the courthouse lawn. As a matter of fact, at the Supreme Court, you still, they've not taken those down. You still have the facade of the Supreme Court in which the 10 Commandments are the cornerstone, literally, of the Supreme Court building. So they can't take those off without destroying the building. But they are understood as commandments. The humble Jewish thinker doesn't look at them as commandments at all. He looks at them, she looks at them as things to be done to lead a good life at peace with oneself and one's neighbor. So they're not commandments, they're positives. We kind of look at a commandment as a negative, but at least in religious theory, at the beginning, they are blessings and not commandments. All right. I hope that's clear. So we're beginning this process that really began earlier than we did, of developing moral theories from religious bases, and then moving into science to analyze those and critically think about them. Now, the religious person doesn't critically think about those. That's the difference between the philosophical and scientific mindset and the religious mindset. But still, proper ethical analysis goes through this process, just like every thinking human being from the beginning of history till now goes through this process of development. Every scientific hypothesis goes through this linear development. All right, enough said about that. This is just something for you to think about. And thinking is important because that's what we're trying to do. That makes philosophy different than sociology or law. For instance, if you break the speed limit, you're going 75 in a 55 zone, and the policeman stops you and says you were going 75 in a 55 zone, where the proper response is, I was thinking about this as I was doing it, and it seemed right to me intellectually to be going 75 miles an hour, and he's going, yeah, and writes you the ticket. That's the difference between a law and philosophy. And if you've ever been in the military and you've gone through boot camp, when the drill sergeant says, all right, hit the floor and do 20 push-ups, you don't ask why, you just do it. That's the difference between law and thinking. In law, you don't think about something. You simply do what you're told, or you get arrested. All right. Now, the most important part of this chapter, as I've alluded to earlier, is the traits of moral principles. Know those. No prescriptivity. No universalizability. And if you read under universalizability, that's really the most important one, I think. Moral principles must apply to all people who are in a relevantly similar situation. What's good with a goose is good with a gander, is the old statement. If I judge that an act is right for a certain person, then that act is right for any other relevantly similar person. That's the most important one of these traits. The third is overridingness. Moral principles have predominant authority and override other kinds of principles. That would be things like don't kill. That overrides every situation. Immanuel Kant, for instance, says that there is he would be what would be in today's world, a no death penalty person, because there's never an excuse for killing someone, legitimately or illegitimate. Every killing of a person is illegitimate, according to Kant. That is an absolute overriding principle. That's just an example of an overriding principle. The fourth is publicity. It has to be public, it can't be secret. And fifth is the practicability aspect that we said that was difficult for Kantian deontology theory to maintain, even though it may be the best worked out of all of those theories, of all of moral theory. All right, now, the domains of ethical assessment. He talks about action, consequences, character, and motive. Read as he distinguishes between the three types of actions: obligatory, optional, and supererogatory. Sometimes the supererogatory is a little bit difficult. It's hard to say, for one thing. And secondly, he could have been clearer about that. Supererogatory acts would be acts like falling on a hand grenade to save other people, or sacrificing yourself, sacrificing your life to save others, especially a stranger. A mother saving the life of her child, is that a supererogatory act? Well, she doesn't have to, but that's what mothers do. But throwing yourself on a hand grenade to save 5 of your friends, that's not what friendship necessarily is. That's kind of over and above any moral requirement. The second of these domains is consequences. And he mentions at the bottom there in that section, teleological ethics, Teleological. Teleos is a Greek word for purpose. So this is kind of like purposeful ethics, ethics done with a plan, focusing on consequences. The best known of these is the Bentham-Mill utilitarianism, which is the leading, probably at least in the Anglo-Saxon world, the leading ethical moral theory. The greatest good for the greatest number. Well, that's got some problems. You might guess what those problems are when you start thinking about the topics that confront us today. Just because the majority wants to do something doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right thing to do. Yet, our principal way of deciding what should be done is this consequential modality or domain. And there are problems with it. When we get into utilitarianism, we're going to do a deep dive into those. The third domain is character traits. And as I said in the lecture the other day, this is really where you find the Greeks are centered around character traits. As a matter of fact, arete for Plato and Aristotle is the principal way of deciding about being a good person, and those are following, and you got to get these 4 virtues here. They're sometimes called the Platonic virtues, sometimes they're called the Greek virtues because even more of the thinkers than Plato used them. They are justice, prudence, moderation, and courage. We're going to talk a lot about those. You might as well get that in your brain right now. Justice, prudence, moderation, and courage. Those are the traits that make a good person. A good person is one who does justice, is prudent, is courageous, and is moderate. That's what it means to be a good person. And those are the same, at least in Aristotle. Those are the judgment about what a good person is, just as winning races is the judgment about a good racehorse. If you got a good racehorse, they don't lay around in the pasture all day long. They do what their name says they do. So that is a horse that wins races is a good horse. A person that does justice, prudence, moderation, and courage is a good human being. That's fulfilling the traits that make for goodness. Maybe it's the simplest of all of the main theories of ethics, and I don't know. The last one is motive. And this is sort of where Immanuel Kant lies here in this category. One of the greatest statement that Immanuel Kant ever made was there's nothing good but a good will. You can't be judged if you set out to do the right thing and acted to do that right thing and fail at doing it. You can't be judged by your failure. You can only be judged by what you intended to do. As an example of this, I often give, if you're going home in the afternoon and you see a car turned upside down, the person's trapped in their seatbelt, and there are flames licking through the upturned bottom of the car, and the car is obviously on fire. You take out your trusty pocket knife and you go over to the person in the car. You intend to free them. You cut the seatbelt. When you do, they fall down on the upside down top of their car, and they break their neck, and they're dead. So in order to save them, you have killed them. Well, your intention was not to kill them. Your intention was to save them from a horrible death. And you know, most people don't like the idea of burning up alive. So your intention was to save them. And most jurisdictions now have what they call the Good Samaritan law that frees you from obligation of death and harm if you do things like cut a seatbelt to free a person from a burning automobile from which they would certainly die. And iatrogenically or without intention cause them harm or death. You're protected. by the law. That simply follows this nothing good but a good will, motive-directed ethics that Kant talked about or developed. So I hope that is helpful to you. Again, I'm going to open this up. If you have any questions right now, unmute yourself or unmute yourself. I hope you're not muted. Unmute yourself and fire away. Okay, going once, going twice, going 3 times. All right, well, for next week, begin reading chapter 2 on ethical relativism. And we'll spend some time on chapter 2 next week. Okay, no questions? In that case, then, I bid you good day. See you later.